The 10 most important premium financing questions to ask in 2023. In this webinar, Darren Sugiyama answers these hard-hitting questions and also provides some brilliant solutions for advisors and their clients. Let's get started. Why are all of these premium financing cases that other intermediaries designed blowing up recently?
Well, I would say the large majority of premium financing cases that are in trouble right now that have been designed by my competitors, right, meaning other premium financing intermediaries, the reason these cases are running into problems is because they had fundamental flaws in the design from the very beginning. So I think a lot of these cases were over-leveraged, meaning that the client was not making their interest payments out of pocket. A lot of them were accruing the interest that was due every year and capitalizing that interest due back into the principal loan balance. In concept, it's not necessarily a wrong way to do it, but what gets a little dicey is that when you're accruing debt at, say, 7 or 8%, which is where interest rates are today, versus a few years ago when they were accruing debt at maybe 2 or 3%, what happens is your loan to value ratio gets thrown off dramatically, wherein the debt is climbing and growing, compounding at an accelerated rate. At the same time, your policy value is kind of struggling down here. So that increase in gap between the principal loan balance with all that debt accrual relative to the policy value, that gap starts to grow greater than expected. When that gap grows greater than expected, the client is going to be required to post more collateral than was originally expected based on the lender's collateral requirements. So if the advisor or if the premium financing intermediary didn't explain these risks to the client at point of sale, however many years ago that was, the client is really unprepared to absorb these much heavier collateral calls than were shown in the original illustration or the proposal. So now all of a sudden the client has to come up with extra collateral. And if that client was not a suitable premium financing client, meaning that they did not have the liquidity to be able to post as future collateral, now the client is really in between a rock and a hard place because the lender is not going to back down off of the collateral that's required. And if the client doesn't have that collateral to post, the lender is going to foreclose on the loan. And when that happens, the client will be forced into surrender. The lender will be made whole by zapping back that collateral plus the policy value. And the client is going to end up with nada. And that's where the lawsuits start to be filed. So for the last several years, I've really been a proponent kind of against these free insurance propositions where the client was not paying the interest payments out of pocket and just capitalizing the whole thing. Quote unquote, zero out of pocket is how these premium financing offers were sold. And I really think that did the client a disservice. It's kind of like if you could go back in time and say buy a bunch of real estate with a negative amortization mortgage loan, say in 2006. We all know what happened in 2008. And so these, again, egregiously aggressive, what I would call egregiously aggressive, over-leveraged, something for nothing type of premium financing arrangements that these plans have been the bane of my existence. I've always hated these plans. But for a lot of advisors, because it's quote unquote easy to sell free, they went out there and sold these free programs to their clients. And now, quite frankly, the chickens have come home to roost. I try to be sensitive to this issue. I try to not gloat in the face of my competitors and tell all these clients and investment advisors and life insurance agents, hey, I told you so, and you should have listened to me several years ago. I try to exude a little bit more class than that. But the reality is that all of these design mistakes that I was so critical of over the last several years, these design mistakes, again, are now coming to fruition, and these cases are blowing up. And we're going to see, I think, a lot more policy surrenders, as well as a lot more premium financing lawsuits against the advisors and the intermediaries that put these programs together. So I'm really proud to say that we've always done this the right way from the very beginning, not over leveraged, using what I would call responsible leverage.
What problems have increased interest rates created for premium financing clients this year?
So I've definitely heard of problems, again, with cases that we didn't finance, that maybe our competitors financed, wherein the clients are upset that the interest rates are substantially higher than they were originally stated in the original proposal. And I would say that fact is not limited to my competitors. I mean, the world has changed a lot in the last 6 to 12 months regarding interest rates. I don't think anyone, myself included, is happy that interest rates have increased so much. But I would say the fundamental difference is that we have always talked about increased interest rates over time. Again, I think a lot of the problems in premium financing have to do with managing client expectations, which is really rooted in the premium financing intermediary and the life insurance advisor being more transparent with the client upfront as it pertains to potential risks in the future, which would include a rising interest rate environment. So if you have, say, clients that were paying the interest or were scheduled to pay the interest out of pocket, and their interest due doubled or tripled because the interest rates have doubled or tripled. Now you have a situation where the client, they better have the liquidity or they better have the cash flow to be able to support those higher interest payments out of pocket. The problem I've seen with a lot of competitors is they have, in my opinion, irresponsibly sold premium financing based on cheap money, right? They said the reason the premium finance was that because rates are so low, and low borrowing rates are not a reason to invest in or to make a financial decision to purchase or allocate funds towards one particular category of funds or asset class. The real focus that a client should be looking at when it comes to premium financing is understanding the long-term positive arbitrage potential between borrowing rates and crediting rates. And the way we do that is we look at historical borrowing rates right next to historical crediting rates. And so the narrative to the client has always been understanding that symbiotic relationship between those two moving variables. Sometimes in a higher interest rate environment, the client is going to be required to pay more out of pocket because their interest due is greater. In those types of environments that should be modeled up front, the client should understand that if, again, the borrowing rate doubles or triples, that they will be responsible for coming to the table with double or triple the interest payment in any given year. So I always say that you should never buy a premium finance life insurance policy because borrowing rates are low, and you should also never do it because index crediting rates are high. Again, either of those two variables in isolation really doesn't tell you the full story. You really have to understand the ongoing relationship between those two variables. Now, in some cases, if the renewing rate that the client is experiencing is abnormally high, or I would say above market standard, or above what we could, the type of interest rate we could get them, sometimes there are opportunities for us to refinance the loan using a different lender and getting that client a better rate. So at least we can take a little bit of heartburn out of the equation. Maybe the rate went from 3% renewing at, say, 7.5%, and we can get them a 7% rate or something like that. In those types of environments, sometimes we can help the client, even if they did not use us as the intermediary from the very beginning. When we do that, we do charge an origination fee or an arrangement fee to be able to refinance that loan. But if we can save them enough on the loan rate, which would save them the out-of-pocket expense on the interest due, that savings, if it would wash out our fee, then you could argue that it would make sense for them to refinance through us. That's certainly not our core business. I'm not all that interested in pursuing that as a core business, but it is a service that we offer. clients, and more importantly, or equally as importantly, the advisors in the advisor community. Because at the end of the day, my client is the advisor. And if that can help initiate and even solidify a relationship to do ongoing business with that advisor, that advisory firm, then I'm willing to help them out, do them a solid, and in many cases, kind of save their butt from a lawsuit or at least a very unhappy client.
How have low index crediting assumptions in carrier illustrations affected policy renewals?
So this is a major problem right now that a lot of advisors are facing, wherein whether the case is financed or not, at the policy renewal, they're showing the client an in-force illustration. Well, that in-force illustration oftentimes is limited in terms of the amount of index credit that they can show in that illustration. As an example, Pacific Life, who is one of my favorite life insurance carriers, my actual personal policy is with Pacific Life, as is my wife's. So this is certainly not a criticism of Pacific Life, but based on AG 49 regulations, some of these Pacific Life policies are renewing with an index credit assumption as low as 4.94%. So sub 5% index credit is what these illustrations are showing. Well, if the policy is premium financed and the premium financing third-party lender renewal rate is, say, 7%, it's a very difficult discussion to have with your client when your illustration is showing a sub 5% index credit. At the same time, the cost of capital is north of 7%. So you're in negative arbitrage land. How do you have that conversation with your client? That's really where our backtesting capability comes in with our backtesting software. So about a decade ago or so, I started developing this, what I would call a proxy for an IUL backtesting software proposition where we could model a proxy for the real world product, in this case, an IUL. And when I say proxy, we had the ability to show the same dollars going into this hypothetical synthetic asset, same dollars going in as what the policy premium was. So the dollars go in, similar charges come out that are very similar to the policy charges. And then the end of year index credit would be applied based on the floor and the cap of the real world product. And so we backtest this and analyze 121 different 40-year historical periods of S&P 500 performance. And it gives us an indication of what the cash value might look like over time based on that historical volatility. So sometimes if the product is designed very well, very efficiently, and the carrier is a strong carrier, sometimes even the 40-year period that produced the worst compounded annual growth rate out of those 121 different 40-year periods we analyze, sometimes the worst 40-year period actually produces a better outcome than what the cash value is showing in the carrier illustration because it's restricted by those AG 49A guidelines in terms of the index credit assumption. We always, for compliance purposes, again, you always have to show the client the carrier paper, right, the in-force illustration. But in my humble opinion, I think it is a great educational tool to show a client how index crediting works in reality and how policy charges work in reality by showing them this model that our backtesting software generates, wherein, again, we're analyzing how a proxy for this real world product would be affected by volatility and floors and caps, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of just showing the client a static suppressed index credit in isolation, being able to show them that as well as a best 40-year scenario as well as a worst 40-year scenario and look at those three different outcomes side by side, I think it is a prudent thing for a client to see a range of outcomes, or I should say a range of potential outcomes, as opposed to just one hypothetical depiction. Because at the end of the day, even the carrier illustration is a hypothetical scenario. So again, our ability to do that for our clients is now actually being extended to other investment advisory firms that maybe did not use us as the premium financing intermediary on an in-force case, wherein they're in hot water, right? They're in deep doo-doo and they need our help. Of course, we do that for a fee. And if you're interested in taking a look at that, you can go to our website, lionsmarkcapital.com, go to our services, and you can go down and click on either refinance an in-force premium finance case, or you can also click on a request to stress test an in-force case. And we can take a look at both of those scenarios and see if we can help you out. Again, we do charge a fee. It's $2,500 an hour. Typically, the average case will take somewhere between 4 to 6 hours to complete our analyzation, but you'll get a full report, back-tested report, and it'll cost you somewhere, but usually between $10,000 to $15,000, which is not a cheap price tag, but it pales in comparison to a lawsuit or a huge chargeback that you might incur if your client decides to pull the plug because the in-force policy looks so much worse, different and worse than what they originally bought.
How do you explain high borrowing rates with concurrently low index crediting rates?
So again, if you're showing a static return in the carrier illustration that is perpetually lower than what you can show in terms of the third-party lender's borrowing rate, that is going to look pretty ugly. So what our back testing software allows us to do is analyze on an ongoing basis back throughout the history of time what the borrowing rate would have been in the same year that we can analyze what the index credit would have been based on S&P performance in that given year and applying the floor and the cap to that. What we found in terms of that symbiotic relationship between the borrowing rates and the crediting rates is, say, if we go back to the years 2000 through 2009, right, otherwise known as the lost decade, the worst decade in modern history. If we look at the trend and the relationship between the borrowing rates and crediting rates, it tells a very interesting story. And in my opinion, this is arguably the most important story to talk to a client about that's thinking about entering a premium financed arrangement. And even for clients that are already in a premium financing arrangement, I think this is incredibly valuable as well. So if you go back to the year 2000, the first 3 years in that sequence, 2000, 2001, 2002, right? That was the dot-com bubble bursting. The year 2000 was the first negative returning year in a little while. And during that time, the borrowing rate was actually higher than today's current borrowing rate as we sit here in August 2023. Well, 2 years after the year 2000, that borrowing rate dropped significantly. And so what we've seen historically is there has been a 2-year lag period between a market correction and an interest rate adjustment. So 2 years after the year 2000, the borrowing rate comes down dramatically, almost got cut in half, and then dropped again, and then dropped again. Well, in 2003, which is the first positive return year after that dot-com bubble bursting, the market did north of 30%. 2 years later, we see the borrowing rate start to increase again, pretty substantially. And then we hit the year 2007, which is the beginning of the mortgage crisis. 2 years later, we see the borrowing rate drop sub 3%, or I should say drop to sub 3%. The borrowing rate would have been, with one of our lenders, 2.55% to be exact. So by tracking this 2-year lag period, this becomes extremely important to communicate to your clients, because in any given year, sure, we can be in a negative arbitrage situation where the cost of capital is, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% during a time where your index credit is zero, assuming that they're using an IUL. And so in a given year, like last year, where most policies experienced a 0% index credit and had cost of capital in terms of the borrowing rate, and then rolling into this year, 2023, where the likelihood of us getting another zero, I would say, is pretty high during a time where the borrowing rates are north of 7% in a lot of cases. Not all cases, but in a lot of cases. I think it's important for clients to understand that negative arbitrage situation historically speaking, has not lasted for more than a 3-year period. And typically, things turn around in a 2-year period. So being able to show them actual historical data in a format that they can understand, that's really where our proprietary backtesting software comes in. And that service is what we offer all of our advisor clients to where we can show this to their clients. From the standpoint of in-force premium finance policies that were not financed through my firm, again, we can still offer those types of services to those advisors' clients, again, for an hourly fee.
What advice would you give an advisor that has an unhappy premium financing client?
As much as I would love to say, well, you should have financed it through Landsmark Capital several years ago. As much as I would like to say that, we do offer this service. Again, we do charge an hourly fee to generate these reports. And even if you need me to get on a Zoom call with your client and walk them through these backtested reports, that is part of our service as well. That's included in that hourly fee.
What if the advisor doesn't want to pay your hourly fee to analyze an in-force policy?
I get the fact that our fee is not cheap, certainly not the cheapest act in town. But I would say that to the advisor that you really have to kind of weigh out the cost of a lawsuit or the cost of a chargeback in comparison to the fee structure that we're charging. So even if the total all-in cost for you for us to do this analyzation and talk to your client was $15,000, if you're avoiding a 6-figure or even a 7-figure chargeback or a 6 or 7-figure lawsuit, the $15,000, $20,000 fee that we might charge, again, pales in comparison to the alternative. So again, I know emotionally no one wants to pay a fee. I understand that you already made your commission. Maybe you already spent the money. But the reality is the liability, the financial liability and the legal liability that you incur by not being able to articulate how this actually works to your client can really expose you and put you in a bad situation as an advisor. So I would say, again, sometimes it may be worth it, sometimes it may not, but I would encourage you to weigh out the costs and the alternative of the fee versus a lawsuit or a chargeback.
Does it ever make sense to 1035 policy values and roll the existing loan to a new lender?
So that's a great question. Sometimes it does make sense to 1035 existing policy value into a brand new policy and start fresh and have us build this properly, responsibly, prudently. And when we do that, sometimes it also makes sense to, I wouldn't say 1035 the debt over, but essentially refinance the current debt with the current lender and roll that over to a new lender. So using a new lender and a new policy, but transferring over the equity from policy to policy and the debt from lender to lender. Sometimes it does make sense to do that. Sometimes it does not make sense to do that. So I recently analyzed a case where that was the proposition by the advisor. And when I really looked at the math and did all of our analytics, because that loan structure was so over leveraged, in my humble opinion, from the very beginning, which is why this case is in hot water, rolling over that debt and continuing to accrue the interest, even if the interest accrual was less because we could refinance the debt with another lender at a lower rate, that rate is still not 2 or 3%. And so accruing that much debt was really putting way too much stress on the loan to value ratio. So in cases like that, sometimes, though it gives everyone heartburn to do this, sometimes it makes sense to pay off the debt with the policy value and or some outside collateral, get out from under that debt and start fresh. I know that makes people feel like, oh, we waste all this time, we wasted all this money, and now we got to start from ground zero again. Sometimes that may be true, but if the insurable need is still there and the interest in a properly designed premium financing arrangement is still there, sometimes it makes sense to scrap and start fresh. Sometimes it makes sense to 1035 those values over and roll the debt. But in many cases, I have seen these so-called premium financing experts with these so-called premium financing rescue programs. And all they're doing is making a commission or an origination fee and kicking the problem down the road that is still going to exist. And quite frankly, is going to multiply to even greater liability for everyone involved at a later date. That is just purely irresponsible. So part of the service our firm does when we analyze a potential refi or a potential back testing type of scenario is we will be very transparent and very blunt with the advisor and tell them whether or not we think any of these solutions are going to be viable solutions for their client. And if they aren't, then we will tell them. I dealt with a case very recently, just a couple of weeks ago. The case was so poorly designed. It was a train wreck waiting to happen from the very beginning. And that train wreck has turned into something even worse because the 3.5% loan rate that this was built on is now renewing north of 7%. And so the train wreck is going to happen even sooner than expected. It's an absolute mess. And after attempting to help the advisor and analyzing and seeing what we could do, my final recommendation was, unfortunately, lawyer up, try to settle quick, but be prepared to write a big fat check because your client is going to come after you. This was not properly done from the very beginning. And so though it pained me to tell the advisor that, I think it built a lot of trust with that advisor. And for future business, I don't think they're going to trust anyone to do their premium financing arrangements outside of us, because we're the only ones that could transparently explain to them what the flaws were in this design and what the design really should have looked like from day one.
How is an advisor supposed to keep up with the ever-changing landscape of premium financing?
Well, that's absolutely true. The premium financing landscape has changed dramatically over the last 6 to 12 months, and I expect it will continue to change pretty frequently and pretty radically for some time now. A couple of years ago, I wrote this book, Premium Finance Life Insurance, the key to effective estate tax planning, that really goes through the details of our methodology in terms of how we do premium financing, and really serves as an educational tool for advisors, quite frankly, and clients to help them understand the premium financing proposition and how it should be positioned, how it should be designed. But I really started thinking, because the landscape is changing so radically, not only is this book already out of date, I realized I think I need to publish a new edition of this book, possibly annually. So I'm actually in the process of writing the second edition to this book. Hopefully I'll be able to get this out before the end of 2023. But that, I think, is a valuable piece of content that the advisor community will continue to enjoy year after year as I continue to publish and republish new editions of this book with updates in terms of what's happening in premium financing, how the landscape has changed, and how we are constantly evolving, designing new programs and new platforms for our advisor clients as well as their clients.
What should an advisor do if they have an in-force premium financing case they want you to refinance?
Yeah, so if you have a case that you think you might want to refi or stress test, or both, you can go to our website, lionsmarkcapital.com. You can click on our services on the top toolbar menu at the top of the homepage. And then you can scroll down and click on either refinance an existing premium financing case or stress test an in-force case. And that will take you to a page, an intake form, where you can tell us a little bit about your client, a little bit about the current situation, and we will analyze the information that you input into that form. And then we can set up a Zoom call to discuss whether or not we think you can help you on that particular case.
How are you able to build these superior mathematical tools that no one else can?
Well, the answer is pretty simple. I'm Asian, which means I'm genetically superior at math.